Chapter 13. Bingo and Ale. A week of icy silence had descended upon the Brocket household, broken only by the occasional sound of Mrs. Brocket's teeth grinding whenever Mabel's footsteps passed nearby. The mistress of the house had taken to dispatching orders through Isabella or Marianne rather than risk direct contact with Mabel, treating her presence with the sort of careful avoidance usually reserved for victims of the plague. Her mind churned with both recent indignities and the absolute necessity to find a replacement. After all, one could hardly retain a servant who had orchestrated one's public humiliation, no matter how difficult it might be to find help willing to work at the estate. And now, as Mrs. Brocket stood before the Fox and Ferret on the evening of her impending humiliation, she wondered if perhaps she should have simply murdered Mabel in her sleep and been done with it.
The Fox and Ferret had never seen such a crowd. Every resident of Lesser Mudbury who could walk, crawl, or be wheeled seemed to have descended upon the establishment, their faces alight with the particular gleam that comes from anticipating another's mortification. Mrs. Brocket stood in the tavern's grimy back room, regarding her reflection in a spotted mirror with the sort of horror usually reserved for finding uninvited relatives at one's doorstep. The stained apron Mabel had provided appeared to have witnessed several decades of spills, while the cap perched precariously on her head bore suspicious evidence of previous wearers. "All right then, Mrs. B." Mabel's voice cut through the general din like a rusty saw, her words carrying that particular looseness that comes from an afternoon spent in close communion with the gin bottle. "Time to get them drinks flowing. And don't you forget to smile. Charity's all about putting on a happy face, ain't it?" She swayed slightly, steadying herself against the doorframe with a hiccup. Mrs. Brocket turned to face her tormentor, who was resplendent in what appeared to be a pressed apron and an expression of pure satisfaction. "I fail to see why I must wear this burial shroud while you parade about in relatively clean attire." "Well now," Mabel replied, fiddling with Mrs. Brocket's cap so it sat all skew-whiff. "Can't have the boss looking like a ragamuffin, can we? Bad for the folks, that'd be. Now then, table 3 wants 6 pints, 2 gin and tonics, and a brandy for old Mrs. Higgins, though 'tween you and me she don't need no more brandy, but it's charity night, ain't it?" Mrs. Brocket lifted the laden tray with all the enthusiasm of a condemned prisoner approaching the gallows. As she navigated through the crowd, she could hear the whispers and poorly suppressed sniggers. Would you look at that? Mrs. High and Mighty herself, serving ale like a common barmaid. "Reckon that apron's seen better days, much like her social standing, eh?" The evening proceeded with the sort of relentless efficiency that only occurs when fate has decided to be particularly vindictive. Every time Mrs. Brocket completed one task, Mabel would appear with another, each more demeaning than the last. "Table 5 needs a scrub, Mrs. B. Make sure you get in them corners. We ain't having sticky tables at a charity do, are we? And old Mr. Thimble's gone and spilled his ale again. Grab the mop next, will ya? And while you're at it, he needs another pint. On the house, since it's charity and all." The arrival of Lady Uppington caused a momentary hush to fall over the tavern. She swept in like a particularly well-preserved thundercloud, her eyes immediately fixing upon Mrs. Brocket, who was at that moment attempting to mop up Mr. Thimble's latest contribution to the floor's sticky patina. "My dear Penelope," Lady Uppington's voice dripped with the sort of concern that conceals daggers, "how charitable of you to participate so thoroughly in this evening's festivities. Though I must say that particular shade of ale stain rather compliments your complexion." Mrs. Brocket straightened up, clutching her mop like a shield. "Lady Uppington, how kind of you to—" Mabel's voice cut through any chance of a dignified chat. "Quit mucking about with that mop and get behind the bar. Them ales ain't gonna pull themselves, are they?"
Lady Uppington's eyebrows ascended to heights previously unknown to facial expressions. "Ah, I see you've embraced the full spectrum of tavern duties. How comprehensive of you! Though perhaps you might want to adjust your grip on that beer pull. One wouldn't want to appear unpracticed in front of one's peers."
"I assure you, Lady Uppington," Mrs. Brockett replied through gritted teeth, "this is merely a temporary—"
Mabel popped up beside them, grinning like a cat.
"Oh no, Mrs. B's taking to it like a duck to water. Might make it a regular thing, we might. Every Thursday, maybe. Could always use extra hands, especially ones eager to learn the ropes."
Mrs. Brocket's attempt to respond was interrupted by a crash from the far corner, where Mr. Thimble had managed to upend not only his fresh pint, but also his entire table.
"Better hop to it, Mrs. B," Mabel hollered cheerfully. "Can't have our charity night looking a mess, can we? Lady Uppington, fancy our finest port? On the house, of course. Mrs. Brockett here insisted on picking up your tab tonight."
As Mrs. Brockett made her way to the scene of Mr. Thimble's latest disaster, she could hear Lady Uppington's measured tones. "How thoughtful of dear Penelope! Though I must say, Mabel, you seem to have quite a talent for organisation. Perhaps you might consider offering your services for my next garden party. In a supervisory capacity, of course." The evening wore on like a persistent toothache. Mrs. Brockett found herself serving increasingly elaborate drink orders to increasingly unsteady customers, all while Mabel's voice rang out with fresh commands.
"Table 8 needs more nuts, Mrs. B, and mind you count 'em out proper. We're running a charity here, not a feast for the gentry."
"Someone's been sick in the ladies' necessary. Right up your alley, Mrs. B. Ain't you always saying how you like things clean and proper?" Each task seemed designed to chip away another fragment of Mrs. Brockett's dignity, while the assembled crowd of Lesser Mudbury's finest watched with the sort of fascinated horror usually reserved for public executions. The final insult came as Mrs. Brockett was attempting to serve a precarious tray of drinks to a group of farmers who had apparently decided that charity night was the perfect occasion to sample every variety of ale available.
"I say, Mrs. Brockett,"
one of them called out, his voice carrying across the crowded room.
"Never thought I'd see the day when you'd be serving me. Remember last month when you had me thrown off your property for letting my sheep graze too close to your roses? Funny how things turn out, ain't it?"
Before Mrs. Brockett could formulate a suitably cutting response, Mabel appeared at her elbow.
"Now then, Mrs. B, no dawdling. Them gentlemen need their drinks, and we've got the bingo to set up, though—"
She paused, examining Mrs. Brockett's increasingly dishevelled appearance.
"Might want to straighten that cap first. Can't have our number caller looking like she's lost a fight with a tornado in a laundry room, can we?"
Mrs. Brockett's fingers tightened around the tray handle with enough force to leave permanent indentations. The evening had barely reached its halfway point, and already she could feel her carefully constructed social standing crumbling like week-old scones. As she distributed the drinks, trying to ignore the barely concealed smirks and whispered comments, she caught sight of her reflection in the window. Her hair, usually immaculate, had begun to escape its pins in rebellious wisps. The stained apron hung askew, bearing fresh evidence of Mr. Thimble's drinking habits. And her expression, well, it was the sort of expression that suggested someone was mentally composing a list of names for future reference, with particular attention to revenge served at room temperature.
"Time to get the bingo going. Mrs. B, be a love and grab them number balls from the back room, and try not to drop 'em and send 'em rolling under Lady Uppington's skirts. Last thing we need is you crawling about on all fours under her picking 'em up."
The assembled crowd tittered as Mrs. Brockett felt her face flush.
As she made her way to the back room, she could hear Lady Uppington's carrying whisper. "Should think so too. Really, Mabel, you must tell me your secret. I've never seen Penelope so amenable to instruction. Perhaps there's hope for her yet." Mrs. Brocket's fingers closed around the bag of bingo balls with the sort of grip usually associated with strangling annoying poultry. The night was young, and somewhere between calling numbers and serving ale, she would find a way to turn this situation to her advantage. After all, she hadn't spent years terrorizing lesser Mudbury society without learning a thing or two about revenge. The bingo balls rattled ominously in their bag, like the distant thunder of approaching retribution. "Righto!" Mabel's voice boomed over the packed tavern. "Time for the main event. And here's your caller for the evening, the oh-so-charitable Mrs. Brocket." Mrs. Brocket stood before the assembled crowd, clutching the bag of bingo balls as though it might bite her. The rickety podium Mabel had provided seemed designed specifically to wobble at the slightest movement. "Get on with it," Mabel hissed, giving Mrs. Brocket a not-so-gentle shove. "And remember, loud and clear, just like we practiced." Mrs. Brocket cleared her throat, adopting the tone she usually reserved for putting the vicar's wife in her place at garden parties. "I shall now commence the evening's numerical selections." She reached into the bag and withdrew the first ball, holding it as though it were something recently deceased. "I declare the first offering to be that which represents 3/4 of a score with an additional pair of units." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. "What's she on about?" someone called from the back. 17! Mabel yelled, rolling her eyes. "She means 17! Write it down, you lot!" Mrs. Brocket's nostrils flared at the interruption. She extracted another ball. "The next designation shall be the sum total achieved when one combines a score with its half, then deducts the number of days in a fortnight." The crowd's confusion deepened into bewilderment. "That's 26!" Mabel hollered over the grumbling crowd. "Get a move on, Mrs. B. We ain't got all night." As Mrs. Brocket continued her increasingly baroque number descriptions, she noticed something odd while fetching another round of drinks. Behind the bar, partially concealed by empty barrels, sat several casks bearing unfamiliar markings. Squinting in the dim light, she made out what appeared to be "Dubious Dunstan's Discount Drafts," scratched into the wood. "The subsequent numerical value," she announced, her mind working furiously, "represents the quantity one might achieve should one multiply the number of commandments by the Trinity, then subtract the deadly sins." "What's she going on about now?" someone grumbled. 23! Mabel shouted, her voice strained. "She means 23! Just say 23!" Mrs. Brocket ignored the interruption, her attention divided between the increasingly restless crowd and Mabel's suspicious behaviour. Her maid was moving between certain tables, exchanging whispered words and meaningful glances with a select group of patrons. During a brief respite to serve more of the questionable ale, Mrs. Brocket overheard a snippet of conversation between Mabel and old Mrs. Higgins, whose brandy consumption had reached alarming proportions. "Don't you worry," Mabel was saying. "When I call out, 'Check them cards careful like,' that's your signal. You'll have the winning numbers right enough." Mrs. Brocket's eyes narrowed. So that was Mabel's game, rigging the charity bingo to benefit her conspirators. She filed this information away alongside the mystery of the dubious ale barrels. "I hereby announce," she proclaimed, returning to the podium, "a figure equivalent to the age at which one might consider spinsterhood inevitable, less the number of years one typically serves in domestic employment before being dismissed for gross incompetence." The crowd's patience was wearing decidedly thin. "She means 42! Mabel translated, shooting Mrs. Brockett a warning glare. "Though if you ask me, she's got them calculations a bit wrong."
Mrs. Brockett responded by selecting another ball with exaggerated precision.
"Observe, if you will, a quantity that mirrors the traditional duration of biblical tribulations, multiplied by the number of horses typically found pulling a gentleman's carriage." "Oh, for heaven's sake!" Lady Uppington's voice cut through the confusion. "Mabel, dear, perhaps someone else might be better suited to the task. Someone who doesn't treat number calling as an opportunity to demonstrate their questionable grasp of mathematics." Now, Mabel cut in, though her grin was getting a bit tight. "Mrs. B's doing her best, ain't she? Even if she's making it sound like some posh sums lesson." Mrs. Brockett, seizing the opportunity to investigate further, announced a brief intermission to refresh drinks. Behind the bar, she examined the suspicious barrels more closely. The seal on one appeared to have been tampered with, and there was a distinct aroma that suggested the contents might be better suited to cleaning windows than consumption. Her suspicions were confirmed when she overheard two of Mabel's confederates discussing their impending winnings. "Reckon she's got it all worked out," one whispered. "Between the rigged game and that dodgy ale she got cheap from her cousin, she'll make enough to take that trip to Brighton she's been planning." Mrs. Brockett's mouth curved into a smile that would have sent small children running for safety. So Mabel thought she could orchestrate a scandal and profit from it. Two could play at that game. Returning to the podium, she adopted an even more refined tone. "Let us proceed with a numerical value that one might derive from contemplating the age at which a servant's usefulness expires, divided by the number of times said servant has been discovered napping in the pantry this week." Mabel's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "The next offering," Mrs. Brockett continued smoothly, "represents the quantity of suspicious barrels one might discover behind a certain establishment's bar, multiplied by the number of conspirators involved in an ill-conceived scheme." A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd, but Mrs. Brockett noticed several of Mabel's accomplices shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "Get on with it!" someone shouted. "Just call the blessed numbers!" "Very well," Mrs. Brockett replied, selecting another ball with deliberate slowness. "I present for your consideration a figure equal to the potential fine for serving questionable spirits, expressed in guineas." Mabel's face drained of colour until it matched the sour milk crusting in forgotten cups along the bar. "Perhaps," Mrs. Brockett continued, her voice dripping with false concern, "we should pause to ensure the quality of refreshments being served. I wouldn't want anyone's charitable donations to be spent on inferior products." The crowd's attention began to shift from confusion to suspicion, particularly among those who had been drinking heavily. "Now then," Mabel butted in hastily, "let's not get sidetracked. Next number, Mrs. B, if you please." Mrs. Brockett smiled the smile of a cat who had not only found the cream, but had discovered incriminating evidence about the cream's origins. "Certainly. I observe that the next number corresponds precisely to the number of years one might spend in His Majesty's hospitality for engaging in fraudulent charitable enterprises." The atmosphere in the room had grown distinctly uneasy. Several patrons were examining their drinks with newfound suspicion, while others were squinting at their bingo cards as though expecting to find evidence of tampering. "I think," Mrs. Brockett announced, "that before we proceed we should perhaps discuss the origin of tonight's refreshments, and possibly the curious coincidence regarding certain players' cards." Mabel's face had progressed from pale to ashen. "Right," she blurted out with forced cheer. "Time for a break, I reckon. Mrs. B, a word in private, if you don't mind." But Mrs. Brockett had already selected another ball, her voice carrying clearly across the increasingly restless crowd. How fascinating! This number exactly matches the quantity of suspicious barrels currently residing behind the bar, each bearing the distinctive mark of Dubious Dunstan's Discount Drafts. A most interesting coincidence, wouldn't you agree? The tavern had grown so quiet you could hear Mr. Thimble's ale dripping onto the floor. Every eye turned toward the bar, where the edge of one of the marked barrels was now clearly visible. "And look!" Mrs. Brockett continued, warming to her theme. "The next number corresponds precisely with the number of identical bingo cards I observed being distributed to certain preferred participants." The silence shattered as several voices began shouting at once. Mrs. Brockett stood at her podium, watching chaos unfold with the satisfied air of someone who had not only orchestrated a disaster, but had managed to keep their apron clean while doing so. The fox and ferret had descended into a state that Mrs. Brockett could only describe as deliciously volatile. As she continued her numerical proclamations, she moved strategically between tables, dropping carefully crafted observations like breadcrumbs before pigeons. "I couldn't help but notice," she murmured to Mr. Thimble, while ostensibly wiping his table, "that your bingo card appears identical to Mrs. Higgins. Most peculiar, wouldn't you say?" To a group of farmers near the window. "I trust the ale isn't causing any unusual effects, though perhaps that peculiar burning sensation is entirely normal for spirits acquired from questionable sources." Her voice carried across the room with practiced precision. "The next number shall be equivalent to the potential prison sentence in months for the deliberate misappropriation of charitable funds." Mabel, trapped behind the bar by a crowd of increasingly suspicious patrons demanding explanations about their drinks, shot Mrs. Brockett a look of pure venom. "Now then," Mrs. Brockett announced, selecting another ball with theatrical slowness, "I observe a numerical value that precisely matches the quantity of identical winning cards currently in circulation. How remarkable!" The room erupted in a fresh wave of muttering. Several patrons began comparing their cards with increasing agitation. "And look," she continued, her voice rising above the growing din, "we appear to have our first winner, or should I say, winners." Right on cue, multiple voices shouted, "Bingo!" simultaneously. Mrs. Higgins, old Tom from the post office, and 3 of Mabel's cousins all waved identical cards triumphantly. The silence that followed was the sort that typically precedes a storm. Or in this case, a tavern brawl. "Here now," old Tom growled, squinting at Mrs. Higgins' card. "That's the exact same as mine." "Fancy that," Mrs. Brockett commented airily. 5 winners, all with identical cards, all close acquaintances of our dear Mabel. What are the odds?" "The odds," Lady Uppington observed dryly from her corner, "appear to have been carefully calculated in advance." The situation deteriorated further as the effects of Dubious Dunstan's finest began to manifest. Mr. Thimble, who had consumed a heroic quantity of the suspicious ale, suddenly developed an alarming green tinge. "I don't feel quite," he managed, before demonstrating exactly how he felt all over his neighbour's shoes. "Good heavens!" Mrs. Brockett declared, her voice carrying clearly over the ensuing chaos. "Could this have something to do with those unmarked barrels? The ones with that fascinating warning label about not for human consumption?" The crowd surged toward the bar, where Mabel was attempting to placate them with increasingly desperate explanations. Now, she stammered. "I'm sure it's all a big mix-up." "Mix-up?" roared one of the farmers. "My tongue's gone numb." "And what about these identical cards?" demanded Mrs. Higgins, waving her bingo sheet like a battle flag. "Some charitable event this turned out to be." Mrs. Brockett, seeing her moment, quietly slipped toward the door. but not before making one final announcement. "Oh, and Mabel? I believe those gentlemen approaching the tavern are from the Revenue Office. I took the liberty of informing them about tonight's entertainment, being an upstanding citizen and all." Through the window, the distinctive uniforms of revenue officers could indeed be seen approaching, thanks to a subtle dispatching of a messenger and a half-crown earlier. The tavern erupted into complete pandemonium. Several patrons made desperate attempts to reach the doors, only to find their legs had developed interesting new ideas about coordination. Others demanded immediate refunds, while a few of the more creative souls began composing spontaneous protest songs about the quality of the ale. "You can't leave me here," Mabel screeched, trying to clamber over the bar as the revenue men came in. "This is all your fault."
"My fault?" Mrs. Brockett paused at the door, savouring the moment. "I merely called numbers in a particularly refined manner. You're the one who decided to orchestrate this little scheme. Though perhaps next time you'll think twice before attempting to publicly humiliate your betters."
With that, she stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving chaos to bloom like a vigorous weed in her wake. Behind her, she could hear the revenue officers' stern voices mixing with accusations about rigged games and poisoned ale, all accompanied by the sound of Mr. Thimble being spectacularly ill in the corner. The journey back to her estate had never felt so satisfying. Each moment took her further away from the chaos, while bringing her closer to the knowledge that her position in Lesser Mudbury society had been, if not exactly elevated, at least forcefully reasserted. Until a mile away, she could still hear distant shouts from the direction of the Fox and Ferret. A small smile played across her face as she imagined Mabel attempting to explain the presence of unlicensed spirits and fraudulent charitable activities to the stern-faced revenue officers. The following morning, Mrs. Brockett sat in her drawing room, sipping tea and reading a hastily penned note from Lady Uppington. "My dear Penelope, while your number-calling technique left something to be desired, your handling of the evening's revelations was nothing short of masterful. Do call round for tea soon. I find myself eager to discuss the night's events in detail, particularly the creative ways in which justice can be served alongside questionable ale. Yours sincerely, Lady Uppington." Mrs. Brockett set down the letter with a satisfaction that bordered on the indecent. The morning paper had already carried a brief but pointed article about the unfortunate incidents at the charity event, though it notably failed to mention her role in exposing the scandal. And what to do with Mabel? She pondered dangerously, tapping one perfectly manicured finger against her teacup. The old adage about keeping one's acquaintances close and enemies closer seemed apt. Yes, she thought, allowing a smile that would have made Machiavelli proud to grace her features. Yes, indeed, for the time being. After all, what better way to ensure Mabel's suffering than to keep her employed, without pay for the foreseeable future naturally, under the closest possible supervision? The girl would be lucky to find employment as a scarecrow in Lesser Mudbury after this debacle, let alone a position in service. No, better to keep her where she could be watched, controlled, and subjected to the exquisite torments that only a truly creative employer could devise. Mrs. Brockett felt a warm glow of anticipation at the thought of all the unpleasant tasks she could assign, tasks that would make scrubbing the cellar steps with a toothbrush seem like a holiday at Brighton. Though not quite like the one Mabel had been planning. It was, she reflected, the sort of challenge she was uniquely qualified to excel at, having spent years perfecting the art of making subordinates wish they'd never been born. Mrs. Brockett cast her thoughts upon the inhabitants in town, some of whom were still making their unsteady way home from the previous night's festivities. One of which walked impossibly around in circles, still under the influence of dubious Dunstan's finest. Her reflections led to a satisfied smile. Let them try to humiliate her again.
She'd shown them exactly what happened to those who dared to challenge her position in lesser Mudbury society. The fact that she'd managed to do so while maintaining an air of refined dignity, if one overlooked the apron, only made the victory sweeter.
As she sipped her tea, Mrs. Brocket began composing a mental list of all those who had seemed a little too amused by her temporary position as barmaid. After all, one could never be too prepared for future social engagements, and she had so many new numerical analogies to share. She imagined the distant sound of the revenue officer's cart rattling through Lesser Mudbury's streets like music to her ears. Sometimes, she reflected, revenge was best served not cold, but with a side of questionable ale and rigged bingo cards.